The freezing December rain hammered the streets of Detroit as Frank Sullivan, 67, wrapped himself tighter in the torn blanket that shielded him from the cutting wind. His trembling hands, marked by decades of hard labor and 3 tours in Vietnam, clutched a soaked piece of cardboard that read, "Veteran, need help." Passers-by hurried along, avoiding his weary gaze, as if his presence were an uncomfortable reminder that the American dream does not always come true. No one imagined that this invisible man, ignored by society, had once saved lives on distant battlefields, much less that, within hours, his own life would descend into a nightmare from which he might never wake. The municipal shelter had closed its doors early that night, leaving Frank and 16 other homeless veterans at the mercy of the storm rolling in. He found refuge under the awning of an abandoned convenience store on Cass Avenue, an area notorious for violence and drug trafficking. His military medals, tucked inside a plastic bag in his worn-out backpack, were the only treasures left from a life that had once carried meaning and purpose. The distant wail of sirens echoed through the night, blending with the sound of the rain in an urban symphony of despair. Frank didn't know those sirens were heading straight toward him, carrying with them the end of his freedom. 3 police cruisers boxed in the awning at 3:47 a.m., under their red and blue lights slicing through the darkness like neon knives. "Frank Sullivan, you are under arrest for the murder of Margaret Whitfield," shouted Detective Richardson as armed officers leveled their weapons at the confused and terrified veteran. Frank raised his trembling hands, unable to grasp what was happening, his faded blue eyes reflecting the panic of a man who had faced death in combat but never imagined being accused of taking another human life. Cold handcuffs bit into his wrists as the Miranda rights were read mechanically, each word landing like a death sentence. The rain kept falling, washing away the tears that began streaming down the old soldier's wrinkled face. The inside of the police car reeked of cheap disinfectant and fear as Frank was transported to Central Precinct under the curious stares of the few souls braving Detroit's deserted streets that night. Through the fogged-up window, he watched his hometown roll by like a slow-motion film, every familiar corner now twisted into something menacing under the crushing weight of his new reality. Margaret Whitfield. He recognized the name from the newspapers. The wealthy philanthropist had been found dead in her mansion 3 days earlier, in a crime that had shocked Detroit's elite. How could a homeless veteran possibly be tied to the murder of one of the city's most influential women? The question echoed in his confused mind as the station lights drew nearer, promising answers he dreaded to uncover. Interrogation room number 3 at Detroit Central Precinct was a claustrophobic cube of gray walls and flickering fluorescent light, where Frank Sullivan found himself seated on a cold metal chair at 5:30 a.m. Detective Richardson, a burly, middle-aged man with predatory eyes, slammed a brown folder onto the table with enough force to make Frank jump. "We've got everything we need to send you straight to the electric chair, Sullivan," the detective snarled, his voice dripping with a disturbing sense of satisfaction. Crime scene photographs spilled across the table like cards in a macabre game. Margaret Whitfield, 58, lying dead in her private library, surrounded by blood-stained books in a brutal tableau too horrific to process. Frank's empty stomach twisted violently, not only from the hunger that had tormented him for days, but from the cruelty of the images forced upon his tired eyes. "Your fingerprints were all over the house, veteran," Richardson pressed on, lighting a forbidden cigarette as if rules no longer applied in his moment of investigative triumph. Frank shook his head desperately, his trembling hands trying to form words that could explain the inexplicable, but his dry throat released only faint whispers. I was never in that house," he finally managed, his voice breaking like glass under pressure. The detective laughed with contempt, a sound that echoed off the cold walls like the howl of a wild beast. The evidence appeared damning, not only his fingerprints, but also fibers from his torn blanket found at the scene, and a witness who swore they had seen him fleeing the property the night of the murder. His court-appointed attorney, Jennifer Walsh, a weary woman in her early 40s with more cases than hours in the day, arrived at the precinct carrying 3 cups of cold coffee and an expression that betrayed defeat before the fight had even begun. "Mr. Sullivan, I'll be straight with you," she said, sinking heavily into the chair beside him, her words cutting through the air with brutal honesty. "The evidence is overwhelming, and the state of Michigan is seeking the death penalty." Frank felt his world collapse around him, as if the floor beneath the interrogation room had turned to quicksand, swallowing not just his body, but his very soul. The realization that he might die for a crime he didn't commit hit him with the force of a grenade, leaving him stunned, unable to process the magnitude of the injustice closing in. The first interrogation lasted 18 relentless hours, during which Frank repeated his innocence again and again, while detectives alternated between false promises of leniency and veiled threats of what awaited him in prison. His eyelids felt as heavy as lead, his mouth as dry as the Mojave Desert, and his ribs ached with every breath, physical reminders of a life on the streets that had already exacted its toll long before this devastating accusation. A war veteran who serves his country only to come home and turn into a killer, Richardson sneered, his poisoned words sinking into Frank's wounded soul like stray bullets. By the time he was finally led to his holding cell, Frank Sullivan was no longer merely a homeless man. He had become the prime suspect in one of Detroit's most shocking recent crimes. The iron bars slammed shut behind him with a sound that would haunt his nightmares in the months to come, sealing not just his freedom, but seemingly also his fate. The Wayne County Courthouse became a full-blown media circus when Frank Sullivan's trial began in March, just 3 months after his arrest, a suspiciously swift pace of justice that should have alerted any careful observer to the dark forces pulling strings behind the scenes. Prosecutor Marcus Thornfield, a 50-year-old ambitious man with obvious political aspirations, strutted before the jury with the confidence of a modern gladiator, brandishing evidence against Frank as if they were war trophies. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," he declared with calculated theatrics, "the man sitting there is not only a murderer, he is the very embodiment of how our society fails to identify predators hiding behind the facade of war heroes." Lee. Thornfield's poisonous words echoed through the packed courtroom as camera flashes captured every moment of the grotesque spectacle, turning the pursuit of justice into a performance for public consumption. Frank, dressed in a borrowed suit, 3 sizes too big for his frail frame, looked even more lost and vulnerable under the unforgiving lights of the courtroom. Jennifer Walsh's defense was as fragile as a house of cards in a storm, undermined not only by her crushing caseload and limited resources, but also by a string of coincidences that seemed to conspire against any chance of Frank receiving a fair trial. Crucial witnesses who could confirm his alibi, other homeless veterans who had been with him the night of the murder, mysteriously vanished from the streets or were arrested on minor charges before they could testify. Detective Richardson took the stand with arrogance bordering on theater, swearing under oath that the investigation had been conducted to the highest standards of law enforcement, while conveniently omitting details about evidence that didn't neatly fit his narrative. Judge Sandra Morrison, known for her heavy hand in high-profile cases, repeatedly sustained the prosecution's objections while rejecting the defense's desperate attempts to question the integrity of the evidence. It was like watching a play where the ending had already been written, and Frank Sullivan was merely an unwilling actor walking toward his final act. The most devastating moment of the trial came when the supposed eyewitness, Maria Santos, a 35-year-old woman with a history of drug problems and multiple arrests, took the stand. With a confidence that contrasted sharply with her chaotic lifestyle, she swore she had seen Frank fleeing Margaret Whitfield's mansion at 11:30 p.m. On the night of the murder, her eyes fixed on the accused with an intensity that seemed almost rehearsed. "I will never forget that face," she declared, her voice trembling with what appeared to be genuine emotion, though sharper observers noticed the gold Rolex gleaming on her wrist, an odd accessory for someone allegedly living on the streets. The defense was barred from questioning the inconsistencies in Maria's testimony, including the fact that she had given investigators 3 different versions of her story, each more detailed than the last. The jury, composed mainly of middle-class citizens who saw in Frank not a veteran in need, but a projection of their own urban fears, absorbed every word as if it were gospel. The trap was closing, and Frank could feel the courtroom walls contracting around him like the bars of a death cell. The final phase of the trial was a public execution disguised as legal process, where justice was sacrificed on the altar of political convenience and the public's thirst for blood. Prosecutor Thornfield delivered his closing argument with the zeal of an evangelist, painting Frank not only as a murderer, but as a symbol of everything wrong with modern America: neglected veterans turned predators, the failure of social programs, the homeless as a looming threat to respectable communities. Margaret Whitfield dedicated her life to helping the less fortunate, he thundered, his voice echoing through the marble columns of the courtroom, and her reward was to die at the hands of a man she likely would have helped if given the chance. Tears welled in the jurors' eyes, visible even from the crowded gallery, as Jennifer Walsh delivered a final, desperate plea that sounded more like a request for mercy than a legal defense. Frank watched it all as a spectator to his own condemnation, his faded blue eyes reflecting not only fear, but a terrible understanding that truth no longer mattered in this theater of cruelty. When Judge Morrison's gavel fell for the last time that day, sealing not just the end of the trial, but seemingly also Frank Sullivan's fate, the echo reverberated like a mercy shot into a justice system already dead and buried. Death row at Jackson State Penitentiary was a tunnel of human despair, where Frank Sullivan was led in shackles and chains like a dangerous animal, while the screams and whispers of other condemned men echoed off the concrete walls like the laments of lost souls. His cell, a 2-by-3-meter cage with a steel bed, a stainless steel toilet, and a small desk where he would spend the coming months writing letters no one would answer, became his entire world, a claustrophobic universe where each passing second drew him closer to death. Guards treated him with a mixture of disdain and professional indifference, as if he were already dead, only waiting for the formality of execution to make official what everyone assumed was inevitable. Frank spent his nights awake, staring at the damp-stained ceiling, trying to understand how a man who had once risked his life for his country was now waiting to die at the hands of that very same country. The irony was as bitter as the cold coffee delivered on his tray every morning at 6, accompanied by the metallic jangle of guards' keys and the relentless reality that each sunrise brought him one step closer to his last breath. The months dragged on like decades in death row, where Frank discovered that the true punishment was not the promise of execution, but the agony of living each day, knowing he was innocent, while the world believed him guilty. He began receiving hate mail from strangers who had followed his trial on television, poisonous letters describing in grotesque detail how he deserved to die, written by people who had never met him but felt entitled to judge his soul. Jennifer Walsh visited once a month, always with the same defeated expression and updates on appeals systematically denied by higher courts, as if the entire judicial system had conspired to ensure Frank Sullivan would never get a second chance. During these visits, separated by bulletproof glass, Frank saw the reflection of his own rapidly aging face, hair whitening week by week, wrinkles deepening like furrows of suffering, eyes losing their spark of hope day by day. His execution date was set for December 15th, exactly 1 year after his arrest, a cruel symmetry not lost on the veteran who had once been trained to find patterns even in the chaos of war. Sarah Chen was a 28-year-old criminal defense attorney, who carried the weight of the world on her shoulders and a passion for justice engraved in every fiber of her being, when she first learned about Frank Sullivan's case through an article buried on page 6 of the Detroit Free Press. The daughter of Chinese immigrants who had built a prosperous life through hard work and sacrifice, Sarah had chosen criminal law not for money or prestige, but out of an unshakable belief that the American legal system should protect the most vulnerable in society. Her downtown Detroit office, a cramped fifth-floor space in a building that had seen better days, was cluttered with stacks of files from clients who couldn't afford expensive private attorneys, cases other lawyers avoided because they offered little financial reward. But something about Frank Sullivan's case unsettled her deeply, an instinctive sense that something was terribly wrong with a story that seemed far too perfect. As she read through the trial details and conviction records, Sarah felt her stomach twist with the same nausea she had once felt years earlier as a law student when witnessing an execution. The visceral certainty that she was staring at a monumental injustice. The first meeting between Sarah and Frank took place on a cold October morning when she drove to Jackson State Penitentiary with a folder full of legal documents and a heart filled with determination that her more cynical colleagues dismissed as dangerous naivety. Frank received her with the natural distrust of a man who had learned not to believe in empty promises, his tired eyes studying the young Asian attorney who spoke with almost feverish intensity about appeals and new evidence. "Why do you want to help me?" he asked through the thick glass separating them, his hoarse voice echoing through the metallic intercom that turned even whispers into distorted, artificial sounds. Sarah looked straight into his eyes. Those same faded blue eyes that had witnessed horrors in Vietnam and now faced a different but equally brutal horror, and simply said, "Because I believe you are innocent. And because if we don't fight for the forgotten, then who will?" It was an answer Frank had longed to hear during months of solitude and despair, but it also awakened a terrible fear within him, the fear of hoping again in a situation that felt hopeless. From that moment on, Sarah Chen was no longer just another lawyer. She had become the last line of defense between Frank Sullivan and the electric chair. Sarah Chen plunged into the investigation of Frank Sullivan's case like an archaeologist digging through layers of lies and negligence, working 18 hours a day while the execution date loomed closer like an inexorable guillotine. She began by re-examining every piece of evidence with the meticulousness of a forensic scientist, uncovering inconsistencies the original defense had missed or ignored. Frank's fingerprints were only on the front door and handrail, places anyone might touch while asking for help, but there were no traces of him in the areas where the murder actually occurred. The private investigator she hired, a retired detective named Tommy Rodriguez, uncovered security footage from a gas station showing Frank asleep under an awning miles away at the estimated time of the crime. Evidence that had mysteriously never been presented at the original trial. Each discovery was like finding pieces of a puzzle that revealed not Frank's guilt, but the magnitude of negligence and possibly corruption that had led to his conviction. The weight of time pressed on Sarah like a giant stone. She had only 7 weeks to undo a year of legal injustice, and every sleepless night in her cramped office reminded her that a human life depended on her ability to uncover the truth before it was too late. Her desperate search for evidence led Sarah into the darkest corners of Detroit, where she interviewed dozens of homeless veterans, recovering addicts and street dwellers who had known Frank during his years on the streets. Maria Santos, the key witness in the trial, had vanished completely afterward. Her last known residence was a luxury downtown apartment she clearly couldn't afford on a homeless woman's income. Tommy Rodriguez found bank records showing a suspicious deposit of $50,000 into Maria's account just 2 weeks before the trial. Money that quickly disappeared through a maze of electronic transfers into untraceable offshore accounts. Detective Richardson, who had led the original investigation, refused to speak with Sarah and threatened to sue her for harassment when she showed up at his house one Saturday afternoon with questions about questionable procedures. Every slammed door, every witness who refused to talk, every obstacle thrown in her path only strengthened Sarah's conviction that Frank was being used as a scapegoat in a conspiracy far larger and more sinister than she had first imagined. With only 26 days left before the execution, she knew she was racing against a clock that didn't just measure time, but the distance between life and death for an innocent man. The truth emerged like a stray bullet on a rainy November night, when Sarah Chen stumbled upon a detail that changed everything. Margaret Whitfield had not been murdered by a homeless stranger, but by her own adopted son, David Whitfield, a 32-year-old assistant prosecutor working in Marcus Thornfield's office. Tommy Rodriguez had uncovered financial records revealing a complex web of embezzlement where David had siphoned millions of dollars from his adoptive mother's charitable funds over 5 years, creating phantom accounts and shell companies to hide his scheme. Margaret had uncovered the fraud on the night of her death, confronting David in her private library with irrefutable evidence of his betrayal. Documents she had secretly collected for weeks before mustering the courage to confront the son she had raised as her own. What should have been a conversation about redemption and restitution spiraled into a violent argument that ended with David striking Margaret with a heavy glass award in a moment of panic and fury that sealed not only her fate, but also his downfall. The most shocking discovery came when Sarah realized David had used his position in the prosecutor's office to manipulate the investigation from day one, steering suspicion toward Frank Sullivan and ensuring the evidence was interpreted to fit a fabricated narrative. The conspiracy stretched far beyond David Whitfield, revealing a network of corruption that included Detective Richardson, who had received substantial payments to conduct a biased investigation, and even Judge Morrison, who held investments in one of the shell companies David had created to launder the stolen money. Sarah discovered that Frank had been chosen as a scapegoat not by chance, but because his condition as a homeless veteran made him the perfect suspect. Someone society had already discarded, whose word would never be taken seriously against that of a respected prosecutor and the son of a beloved philanthropist. Frank's fingerprints in the house had been planted using a glass he had touched days earlier when he asked for water at the front door. Margaret, true to her charitable nature, had given him water and a sandwich, never imagining that this act of kindness would later be twisted to frame him for her own murder. Maria Santos had been paid to lie, her shifting stories the result of a poorly memorized script handed to her by David, who had underestimated the difficulty of sustaining such an elaborate lie under pressure. Most devastating of all was the knowledge that Frank Sullivan had spent nearly a year on death row, not just as the victim of judicial negligence, but as the central pawn in a conspiracy orchestrated by those who had sworn to uphold justice, only to sell it for the price of greed and unrestrained ambition. With only 12 days left before Frank Sullivan's execution, Sarah Chen turned her office into a war room of legal battle, where she and Tommy Rodriguez worked 20-hour shifts, trying to gather enough evidence to convince a higher court that they had uncovered the greatest miscarriage of justice in Michigan's modern history. The walls were plastered with photographs, financial documents, phone records, and a complex map connecting David Whitfield, Detective Richardson, Judge Morrison, and a dozen other conspirators in a web of corruption that stretched like venomous tentacles through the judicial system. David had realized his facade was collapsing and had vanished, leaving behind only digital traces that Tommy followed like a relentless bloodhound through credit card records and banking transactions. Time was not merely an enemy, It was a silent executioner walking beside Sarah, reminding her every passing second that an innocent man was counting down the days to his death, while she fought against a system seemingly determined to protect its own, even if it meant executing the blameless. The pressure was so intense that Sarah had lost 26 pounds in 2 weeks, surviving on coffee and pure adrenaline, her bloodshot eyes reflecting the obsession of someone who knew that a single mistake could cost a human life. The final 72 hours before the scheduled execution were a brutal marathon of legal petitions, desperate appeals, and frantic attempts to track down David Whitfield before he disappeared forever with the secrets that could save Frank Sullivan. Sarah had secured an emergency hearing with the Michigan Supreme Court, but she needed David alive to testify. Without his confession, all the circumstantial evidence in the world would not be enough to halt the execution of a man the state already considered dead. Tommy finally traced David to a cheap motel near the Ohio border, where he found him in a pitiful condition, bearded, paranoid, addicted to amphetamines, and terrified that his partners in the conspiracy would decide he knew too much to be left alive. "They'll kill me if I talk," David whispered through cracked lips, his trembling hands betraying his fear as Sarah begged him to do the right thing and save Frank's life. It became a literal race against death. As Sarah struggled to convince David to confess, Frank was less than 15 hours from execution, spending what might have been his last night on earth writing letters of forgiveness to those who had wronged him, including one for Sarah, thanking her for believing in him when the entire world had abandoned his innocence. David Whitfield's confession came at 4:30 a.m. on the day of the execution in an emergency hearing before the Michigan Supreme Court, where judges were summoned to an extraordinary session that made legal history. David entered the chamber in handcuffs, escorted by federal marshals, his pale and haggard face a stark contrast to the confident, ambitious man who had orchestrated the judicial farce 12 months earlier. With a voice cracking under guilt and terror, he confessed not only to the murder of Margaret Whitfield, but also revealed the names of everyone involved in the conspiracy that had placed Frank Sullivan on death row. "I killed my adoptive mother in a moment of panic when she discovered I had stolen $17 million from her charities," David said, his words echoing through the silent courtroom like confessions torn from a tortured soul. "I used my position in the prosecutor's office to fabricate evidence against Frank Sullivan because I needed a scapegoat, and a homeless veteran was the perfect target. No one would question it. No one would fight for him. No one would care if he died." Undoubted, the revelations poured forth like an avalanche of horror. Detective Richardson had been paid $200,000 to plant evidence and coerce witnesses. Judge Morrison had been blackmailed with compromising photographs David had obtained through a corrupt private investigator, and at least 6 other figures within the judicial system had been bribed or threatened to ensure Frank's conviction. The most devastating moment of the confession came when David revealed that Margaret Whitfield had discovered the fraud because she had been planning to donate an additional $10 million to homeless veteran programs. A cruel irony that meant Frank Sullivan had nearly been executed for a crime that occurred precisely because the victim wanted to help men like him. Sarah Chen, who had spent months questioning whether her crusade for justice was naive idealism, felt tears of rage and relief streak down her face as she listened to David describe how he had manipulated every aspect of the case, from the evidence collection to the jury selection. Presiding Judge William Hayes, a 40-year veteran of the judiciary who thought he had seen it all, later admitted that he had never witnessed such a systematic and elaborate conspiracy to condemn an innocent man. At 6:15 a.m., just 5 hours and 45 minutes before the scheduled execution, the court issued a permanent stay of execution, immediately followed by arrest warrants for Richardson, Morrison, and 12 other conspirators. Frank Sullivan, who had spent the night awake preparing himself mentally for death, received the news from Jennifer Walsh, who ran to his cell with tears streaming down her face, shouting, "Frank, you're free! You're free!" The conspiracy that had sought to destroy him had finally collapsed under the weight of its own evil. But the price paid, a stolen year of his life, his shattered faith in humanity, his devastated mental health, could never be fully restored. Frank Sullivan walked out of Jackson State Penitentiary on a freezing December morning, exactly 13 months after he had been wrongfully imprisoned, carrying only a small bag with his military medals and the hundreds of letters of support he had received after his story became a national headline. The world he stepped into outside those prison walls was different from the one he had left, not merely because technology had advanced or the seasons had changed, but because he himself had become a symbol of the fight against judicial injustice, a living reminder of how catastrophically the system can fail when corruption finds fertile ground. Sarah Chen was waiting for him on the prison steps, no longer the idealistic young attorney who had taken his case, but a hardened legal warrior who had sacrificed her own health and sanity to save the life of a man society had discarded. The embrace between them was more than gratitude. It was a recognition between two souls who had stared into the abyss of injustice and emerged transformed, scarred but unbroken, wounded yet still able to believe that truth, no matter how deeply buried, always finds a way to surface. When Frank whispered thank you in her ear, Sarah knew that those two simple words carried the weight of a life saved and a system forced to confront its own moral failures. The months that followed brought a form of justice as complete as any Hollywood screenwriter could imagine, yet tempered by the bitterness that only reality can provide. David Whitfield was sentenced to life without parole, but not before returning 14 of the $17 million he had stolen, money that was used to establish the Margaret Whitfield Foundation for Veterans in Need, a poetic irony that would have made the slain philanthropist smile in her grave. Detective Richardson and Judge Morrison were not only imprisoned, but forced to endure the same social ostracism Frank had once faced, experiencing for the first time what it meant to be judged and condemned by public opinion before even facing trial. With Sarah's help and using part of the financial settlement he received from the state of Michigan, Frank opened a small support center for homeless veterans in Detroit, a place where society's forgotten could find not only shelter and food, but also the dignity and respect they had lost on the streets. Every night, before closing the center, Frank walked the same neighborhood streets where he had once been arrested, no longer as a fugitive or a pariah, but as a silent guardian of the forgotten, his military medals finally shining with the same pride he had once felt decades earlier in Vietnam. Justice had come, not through vengeance or bitterness, but through the transformation of suffering into purpose, proving that even in the darkest moments of the human experience, redemption is possible for those brave enough to keep believing in the light.